We've got some
Hey,
fresh new
I'm
young
Luis.
talent
And
doing some
I'm
things that I
Luis.
know you haven't
And you're
heard
listening to the
before.
Content is Profit podcast. Boom, boom, boom. Welcome back to Content is Profit. What's up, Fonzie? Welcome back to the studio. Finally got him back. How you doing, man? Have we shared the news on the podcast?
I'm back.
Have we shared the news?
I don't know. What news?
Fonzie's pregnant, everybody. Let's go. Well, not him, his wife.
That is true.
We got to clarify, sadly, in this day and age.
That is true.
And with that, we have...
Don't make a clip of this, just in case. I mean, I'm eventually going to reveal it, but I would like to personally
I know this is only
do
for
something on my own about that.
Only for our podcast listeners.
Yeah, so do not clip that.
Do not clip it. Anyways, guys, today we have an interesting topic. We've been bombarded with podcast clips from the two political campaigns, clips, episodes, everything. I was listening to Joe Rogan and Mr. Trump on the way here, and I think it's really interesting that the presidential candidates have been on a podcast tour more than traditional media, I think. So I thought it was a pretty interesting topic for us to talk about here, and why as business owners we should be paying attention to this and maybe investing in our own platforms and putting our message out there. So Fonzie, have you listened? And obviously, we're going to try to keep it not political at all, but more on the content side of things and what it means to you as a business owner, right? So what are you looking up to there?
Well, I'm looking at some data, last minute data, but what is your question? You didn't give me a question. You just said
I did.
Talk.
Have you consumed any of these episodes or these shows?
I've seen a few. Honestly, the other day I was listening to The Diary of a CEO with Trevor Noah, which he used to host I think it's called The Daily Show. He's like a South African that became the host for The Daily Show. Pretty big. He's a comedian as well. Great episode if you're very interested in his life and all that. But he also mentions in there, he's like, too many people consume too many news. It's like, you don't need to consume news every single day to know what's going on. He's like, honestly, like once a week, you'll be fine. You'll know more actually than people that even consume it every single day, because it is always a developing story and they keep you hooked up. So me personally, I try to stay a little bit away from the noise. I understand obviously the importance of, the elections for here in the US. I personally cannot vote, right? But I like to believe that at least on our close circle have some sort of either influence, or we can talk about it and discuss and maybe, not steer people, that sounds wrong, not steer people to a specific direction, but maybe help them think on a logical basis on the decisions that they're making, right? And then helping them feel confident on whoever they're going to vote, whatever. That being said, that's why I'm not like consuming a lot of political content, but obviously I kept track on knowing that the political candidates have been going to a lot of podcasts, which I find super interesting, which is what we're going to discuss today on why they're doing that. Like, what is the value nowadays on going on like podcast tour with influencers? Yeah,
I think at the time of the recording, Trump has done about 12 podcast shows, and Harris has done 6. So, and also interesting picks, right? There's obviously big shows in there. There's some that are not very well known, but I'm sure like their campaigns, have studied them and vet them to see like what if the message is gonna resonate. But I think like one, I have a data here about from Pot News and research on Vox Topica, right? And it says the listening habits of registered voters, about 85% of registered voters surveyed trust podcasts more than any other news, right? So I'm assuming obviously these are mostly podcast consumers, right? And 78% of respondents agree that podcasts influence them to learn more about issues or topics than the news. So I think that's interesting too. Obviously on the on the assets of today, which is attention, and I think trust is another thing that we need to put in there, because I think like over the last few years it's come very clear with the internet, and I think this was one of the topics that Joe Rogan was mentioning to Trump in his conversation, is that maybe some media will present and a scenario, and then it might be debunked by internet or people posting their own things or point of views directly from the place that this thing is happening. So a lot of people that see those two angles, might distrust the media that is lying to them. So I think this is interesting. And also podcasters, long form content, right? If a consumer sticks with you and they listen to your entire episode a couple times a week, they develop this almost like a relationship with you, and trust starts to happen, and people start to believe on the things that that we might say on the show. And we've seen it on our end, we've seen it with people in the industry, right, on the business side, and I think that's so important. And I think that's why these candidates today are not fighting only on traditional media, but also in modern media, which is, long form podcasting, and then also social media. I think one of the things that Trump was saying was he was bragging about having TikTok, and I think his latest TikToks have been reaching more than 1 billion views, which is pretty insane. Again, I have no numbers on Kamala, but I think it's pretty similar, right, to both ends. And this is without looking at any influencer posts or whatever. But even if you rank podcasts and social media, podcast still ranks really high versus regular social media.
Yeah, I think there's you already mentioned 2 elements in there, which was attention and trust, right? And then the other fact I think is, which again, it ties to both of this, which is distribution, right? I mean, something that online creators have done very good in the last couple of years that I would say traditional media is coming into, and now they're improving, they're putting more resources into this, is distributions of their assets online, right? So now bigger TV shows, right? We've seen it with, like Jimmy Fallon and his show and all that stuff. Like they have these segments that they clip and now they put on YouTube, they put in all over social media, right? Distribute it, try to get more eyeballs, more attention, therefore building more trust, getting people to consume more of the content, right? And I think podcasters have done a great job with distribution. They've done a great job at multi-purposing their content, putting it up on YouTube, putting it up on all social medias, and then getting a lot of exposure. And I came across this point of data on statista.com, right, which is pretty interesting. It says time spent per day with digital versus traditional media in the US from 2011 to 2025. This is in minutes. In 2011, traditional media had about 453 minutes, which is almost 8 hours of the day spent consuming traditional media, in comparison to digital media, which had 214, which is less than 4 hours. It's like 3 hours, something like that, right? And I found it super interesting that in 14 years, right, in 2025, literally flip-flop, right? It changed. And now digital media gets about 8 hours a day of consumption in contrast to traditional media, which gets less than 4 hours a day of consumption. And I would argue that maybe, that traditional media is at the end of the day when people get to their homes, turn on the TVs while they're doing other things, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty impressive because obviously you can see in distribution, like the value of distributing your content in the correct channels, right? Going digital first and, posting all your content in social media, posting your content on YouTube, all these sort of pages is probably going to have a higher yield for attention on what you're trying to create. Yeah. So obviously, politicians, they have huge teams behind them they're helping them. They're working behind the clock to get them the most amount of exposure, right? They want them to expose their message to the majority amount of people so they can influence them and, vote for them, etc. So going into big podcasts, right, going on a podcast tour is huge because, again, it fits the criteria on it is digital, right, where people are spending most of their time, more of their attention. Also, it's a long form type of content that builds a lot of trust. And at the same time, it's kind of like a perfect content for them to multi-purpose and distribute. So now they're leveraging their efforts, right? Donald Trump spent almost 3 hours talking with Joe Rogan on his podcast. Out of those 3 hours, right now, you can create so much content that you're going to pretty much have mini Donald Trumps working around the clock right around the internet because you're publishing them and just reaching millions of people.
I think with that point to it, and I think this is probably one of the biggest fears that we see in our studio with like newer podcasters is maybe the misuse of those clips as well, because obviously, once you put the content out there, it's up for grabs. Anybody can really have it. And I've seen already examples from both sides that they might misinterpret or they might mislabel something maybe of a clip of one long form interview without any context, right? And they grab that piece of information, they publish it like in order to hurt that person. But then when the full interview is consumed, you realize that it wasn't really that the meaning that the first media outlet decided to put out, right? So it's both sides of the spectrum, right? And I think it's really important. This is why, as consumers, right, we have to be aware of that. Be like, okay, there is people playing for both sides. And I think it's a total legitimate fear for a lot of people that publish this type of content. And it's something that we have to live with, if we decide to put content out there. But I think it's absolutely necessary, right? At the end of the day, like if you believe that your product, your message, whatever your ideals is what it should be, I 100% back up the idea that you should be putting those online, because you're going to be attracting those people to come to you. So in this specific example with politics, right, the people that are rooting for candidate A and they see a negative message, they're probably not going to change their mind, but they're going to support that person because maybe they already consumed that long form piece of content and they know that that's taken out of context, for example, right? And to that point, I saw another video from Brett Cooper on the comment section where they were talking about the decision of Kamala Harris going into Call Her Daddy podcast, right? I think it was a pretty controversial one because she was saying, hey, like she's going to this podcast that the majority of the audience already aligns with her ideals and what she's trying to do in her campaign. And she was saying that might be the wrong decision at that point, even though it was one of the biggest shows, because you're not trying to convince anybody new or that's, that might not align with your audience yet to come to your side, but you're just reinforcing the voters that you might already have. What does that mean for a business owner, right? It's kind of knowing like where your audience is, or like where might be people that have not been exposed to your message yet. So at a smaller scale, if you are a podcast host that has a business and has a message and are selling a product, where is the audience that might not know you? Maybe you have been part of a community for a long time and you've already done all those interviews, you already guested in those conversations, you already collaborated with them, and maybe their audience is already familiar with you and they've already purchased. Where are those pockets of people that don't know you, right? And this translates obviously in the biggest stage of the world right now, which is, American politics. It's the same thing. It's like, where can you go to put your message so maybe on the decided voters can, make the decision for themselves because they trust that podcasters that are having these really good questions and, maybe off script interviews with these candidates, right? I think so. I think is an interesting topic.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the topic of trust, I think traditional media has lost a lot of their credibility, right? Because of their highly editorial aspect of things, right? You can see that the interviews are, I'm not going to say scripted, right? But clearly they feed a lot of the questions. There's a lot of cuts, in a way is manufactured, right? And at least that is the impression that I'm under. And that is the belief that I see around a lot of the people and a lot of the commentary that I read about, which is that traditional media has lost the trust from the consumer because they're either trying to push an agenda and like all these conversations that just seem so manufactured, right? But in podcasting, and I'm not saying that all podcasts are like this, I'm sure, this is not a fact, right? But I'm sure that some of the conversations that, these politicians are going into, they probably say, all right, we need a list of questions, like you cannot ask this, you cannot say that, you have to cut this, X, Y, and Z. But maybe platforms such as, Joe Rogan or Call Her Daddy, they're so big that maybe they even have a little bit of leverage in there and they can say like, hey, look, we have to publish this. This is unscripted. This is going to be a conversation. It's going to be raw. We get to publish it like this. Yeah. Again, I have not listened to neither of them. I have not listened to Joe Rogan's conversation with Donald Trump, and I have not listened to Call Her Daddy conversation with Kamala Harris. So, but I like to believe that podcasters of that caliber, right, and that have such a big audience, they do have the power to say like, "Hey, look, this is a raw conversation."
Yeah,
right?
I've consumed both, and I think they're both very raw. I think on the Kamala, maybe the topics that they were, having a conversation around the organic or like unedited conversation was very aligned to the things that she was already saying in media.
That's what I mean by they're clearly editorial in a way before the conversation starts, it's like, hey, this is the direction you can take the conversation.
Yeah. And I think on the other side, and again, we both cannot vote, so whatever we say here like doesn't really make a difference. But on what I've saw with Theo Von, which is another big podcast, even JD Vance, like the vice president, went there too. That conversation I thought was hilarious. They talk about about football, about his family. That really seemed very like not scripted at all. With Trump, I think there were some bullet points there that like Joe really wanted to touch on, which are things that every American probably should be concerned. And my impression was that Trump tried to answer them as honestly as possible to where like, here's how we're going to address the problem. What I saw on the other side was a lot more like talking point answers. And, each candidate has their own styles, right? Whether we agree with them or not. But that's what I saw. And there's to your example of traditional media, there's a very famous one with the show 60 Minutes where the published version of the interview was completely edited, and it was because the real raw footage was leaked about an hour or 2 hours before the actual edit came out. And it was a completely different answer, and you can tell how they pieced it together. So things like that, especially with like newer generations, we see that online, and we see like the before edited version, we see the final edit version. You're like, how can we trust these people? But then Joe Rogan had a good point where it's like boomers, for example, that they might still trust, traditional media, where like it's impossible that a platform like CNN will do this, right? They still don't believe that it's like that. So I encourage every single person to be obviously maybe take everything with a grain of salt, whether it's your side or the other side, whether it's your business or the other business, start asking questions and be like, what's the source, right? There's an incredible book called Trust Me, I'm Lying from Ryan Holiday. And he basically debunks all modern media and puts it how it actually works and how people can really feed information in online. And this is more on the blog side and writing and pushing information. But my point is, I don't think we can fully trust 100% every single person that puts their message out there.
Yeah, but I think first the conversation was meant on like the value of going into podcasts, not just like us having a political conversation, right? Yes, do your due diligence. Don't outsource your thinking to somebody and be like, oh, just because they say so, I'm going to do so. Just do your own research, right? Don't be, I'm saying that we are leaning politically and then I'm going into politics, but don't be a single issue voter, which is what a lot of people here do, or just don't vote because of like, you don't like somebody or whatever. Like do your due diligence. Like what are the policies and all that stuff. All right. And to this political conversation real quick, I'm going to backtrack into the value, what we were talking about, like you as a creator, wanting to turn your content into profit. What do you need to do? What is the key takeaways from these conversations, from the whole political campaign that is going on, the whole movement is first, you need to look for channels and mediums where you can build trust with your audience, right? And as yourself, how do I build trust? Well, maybe highly edited content might not be the way, right? Show up on a true, honest, right? Maybe uncut, raw way that you can showcase your personality, your values, your goals, what you stand for the people that you want to serve, right? Second, you need to master distribution. Where are you? And again, it's not about, we've seen this everywhere. We have different opinions on this, but for me personally, it's not about being everywhere at all times, right? But it's like, well, maybe can you master one channel extremely well, where you can have the distribution that can fit also the type of business model that you have, the business that you want to grow at the moment. And then eventually you can scale, right? Maybe you're at a position that you are already ready to scale, and then you can scale your distribution channels as well. And then lastly is attention, right? Like, where is the attention? How can you leverage your product, your channels to gather more attention? Do you need to go and borrow other people's audiences, just like the politicians are doing right here by going into somebody else's podcast? Or do you need to maybe invest in advertising to try to get new people into your ecosystem? Or do you just rely organically in, for your content? Do you just create content, publish it in the media, and then wait to see if it resonates with people and they want to tune in for you? So plenty of different ways for you to decide how to turn your content into profit, how you're going to go about this. And yes, it can be overwhelming. If you want help with this, feel free to reach out to us at BizBrosCo, Facebook, Instagram. We're everywhere. We're everywhere with that handle at BizBrosCo. Just reach out. We'll be more than happy to help you out, put up a game plan together for you.
Yeah, I know why Fonzie laughed a little bit, because he says, don't be everywhere. And
don't be everywhere,
but let me tell you, when we started...
But we're not, I'm personally not everywhere. Like, I'm literally just on Instagram.
Exactly. But here's the thing too, like, we started just on Facebook Lives. That was our thing, right? Yeah. And then the system evolved, which, at the end of the day, each system is completely different. I'll add one to the top lessons that you said here is, like, have the courage to put your message out there at the end of the day. Without that, you're not going to be able to communicate with new people that might need your product or your service, right? And I had that conversation a couple of times last week with people that are recording their podcast here in the studio, where we're recording some of their ads and call to actions, as in for people that are interested in their services or the offer that they're doing. And for some reason, most people are like really afraid to say it and be like, there's like a fear, I feel like that we've seen with a lot of people that start publishing. And I'm like, do you truly believe that your product or your service is going to help somebody? And the answer more than likely is yes. And I'm like, okay, well, it's a disservice not to publish content or not to tell them how to do business with you. So I encourage you to put it out there, even if it's, a quick live Instagram video or a tweet or a picture on Facebook, just inviting people to connect with you about the problem that you're helping them solve. So at the end of the day, like, just quick recap, right? Look for channels and mediums where you can build trust with your audience, master distribution, where's the attention, and have the courage to put your message out there. So
that's right. I'm boycott traditional media. I'm kidding. But I'm not. Who knows? Maybe I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to hear more about this, I mean, our own experience, we come from Venezuela, no secret, right? We lived through media being censored in many ways. So if that's something that interests you, just let us know and we can maybe share our experience here and there. But like I said, this is not a political show. We're just trying to extract some of the lessons that these people are doing out there with their content, what we observe in the content industry. And
there's a lesson everywhere.
Yeah, hopefully it helps you. So anything else, Fonso, that you want to add?
Nope. I'm out.
Guys, with that said, thank you so much for tuning to the Content's Profit podcast. Go ahead and follow the show in your favorite podcasting platform and on social media at BizBrosCo.
That is right. If today's episode helped you move one step closer towards your goal, please don't forget to share this episode. And of course, don't forget to leave a 5-star review. See ya.
Bye, guys.
Ciao.